We've recently gotten word that Kodak is about to change the formulation across the board of one of their most popular products. And in this video, we're going to talk about what these changes are, why they may be doing this, and what this means for film photography more broadly. Let's get into it. Last year, one of my most popular videos had to do with Kodak crushing film resellers. And the gist of that video was it talked a little bit about the practice of folks who were in the business of repackaging Kodak cinema film. Over the course of film photography's recent comeback, one of the most popular ways for folks to save money was to buy repackaged Kodak cinema film instead of buying dedicated color film, like Kodak Gold or Lomo 800 or Cinestill 800. Folks would oftentimes look to one of these third-party mom-and-pop film resellers to buy Kodak's products at maybe a little bit cheaper price. Well, for a bevy of reasons that we got into in that video. And unfortunately, last year, everything changed. Kodak started issuing notices that they wouldn't any longer be selling their bulk 100-foot, 200-foot, whatever, rolls of cinema film any longer to folks who were outside of the cinema film industry, right? Who are outside of the movie business. They were requiring a proof that you're actually using Kodak cinema film products to actually make a movie. They weren't just selling it to anybody who wanted to cut it up and sell it as still film. And we got into the reasons in that video. The first and most obvious reason is that there's probably some sort of arrangement between Kodak and Kodak Allaris. For those of you who don't know, there are actually two Kodaks. Kodak, the one in America that actually makes the film, and then Kodak Allaris, who holds a lot of the distribution rights of some of Kodak's products. And perhaps this just became an issue between the two because you had Kodak in America who's selling cinema film still to production companies, but in actuality, they're ending up with some still film sales by extension as well, because you've got these resellers who are buying Kodak's movie film to cut it up and sell it as still film. And that's perhaps cannibalizing on some of Kodak Allaris' business, who has the distribution rights to Kodak's still film. So that's one issue we think this change might have been implemented by Kodak, but there were others as well, one of which I speculated was that maybe Kodak was interested at some point in selling their own film products, right? That they weren't any longer going to offload film to Cinestill or sell it to these third-party folks, and maybe they wanted this business for themselves. And that still may be an actual path that they go down, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But let's talk about these most recent changes. It's recently been announced by Kodak that they have redesigned their Vision 3 product line. And it's taken them every bit of 8 years to do that, and they've spent all this time removing the rimjet from their cinema film. For the longest time, that was the biggest problem with these film resellers. The rimjet layer had acted like an anti-halation layer or an anti-static layer. And for our purposes, the removal of the rimjet layer allows for a simpler C41 process instead of the more complex ECN2, which makes development easier for DIY enthusiasts and small labs. However, removing the rimjet layer from the film stock hasn't been an easy task. Obviously, I stated it took them 8 years, and there were a couple of reasons why. Kodak not only needed to replace it with a different anti-halation system, but they also required a complete redesign of the layering system within the film stock in order to keep the same overall film thickness, right? You take out a layer, that's going to change the thickness of the film. So removing the rimjet layer caused problems in other areas, and they had to engineer around this. That's what they spent all that time doing. The new system is called AHU, or anti-halation undercoat, and instead of forming part of the base layers like rimjet, is now part of the emulsion layers itself. And this sounds simple, right? Not really, but we'll keep going. Doing this meant that the existing emulsion layers needed to be made thinner, which in turn meant totally recalibrating them so that there wouldn't be any unwanted color shifts or exposure differences from the previous versions of the film stock. The fact that it has taken 8 years of research and testing to reach this point is a testament to how complicated the engineering challenge was and how creative the solutions from Kodak had to be to overcome it. And they go on to state that this change will be implemented across all Vision 3 lines, potentially making film processing more accessible, affordable for smaller labs and home users. And I think there are a couple of big things that we can extrapolate from that. The first and the most obvious is this is really good news that Kodak is still investing in and still working on new film products. They're still trying to solve engineering challenges, and their film photography products are still in active development. So that's super cool. That means that we can continue to perhaps hold out hope that we'll get more new film products from Kodak in the future because they're still working on stuff, right? They've had this big, complicated challenge that it took them 8 years to solve. Obviously, they plan on keeping film on the market for at least the foreseeable future if they're willing to invest so much in the R&D to solve this challenge. I think it's also worth noting that this change is going to have an effect on the film labs out there, especially motion picture film labs. Their whole infrastructure system set up to develop things in the ECN2 process. It's safe to say this is probably the death knell for ECN2. And with Kodak removing that rimjet layer from their film stock and no longer requiring that specialized processing system to develop cinema film, I'm hopeful that we can see development costs end up going down, especially if you're trying to get movie film developed. This also further goes to the hypothesis I had in my old video that maybe Kodak at some point want to implement their own products, right? They would want to implement their own still versions of their Vision 3 cinema film stocks. I think the fact that they've completely eliminated the rimjet layer and eliminated the need for you to get that specialized, hard to find ECN2 development process, I think that this is another feather in the cap that maybe at some point in the future we'll see officially branded, 800T or officially branded 50D at some point from Kodak. This is another step that kind of points in that direction. And I think for film photographers out there, this certainly makes it easier for us, provided that Kodak will actually sell us the big rolls of cinema film. This makes it a lot easier. We no longer have to solve that complicated problem of what are we going to do about the rimjet layer? Are we going to try to remove the layer ourselves with a complicated chemistry experiment in our bathroom? Or are we going to try to seek ECN2 development from one of the, 5 labs in the United States that do it? This makes it much easier. This means that if we're able to buy those rolls from Kodak, we can hand roll the film ourselves and we can have it sent into any regular old lab around the block and get our film developed at a much cheaper cost. So I think this is a net positive for film photographers out there. This makes it much easier, much more achievable for us to hand roll and use Kodak cinema films in our cameras. This was a headline that when it came out, it didn't get a ton of discussion, but I actually think it's one of the biggest changes implemented by Kodak in recent history. I think you have to go all the way back to the reintroduction of Ektachrome a few years ago to find something equally as monumental as this. I think it's a big win for film photographers out there. I think that it's going to lead to hopefully lower prices for those of us who are shooting. Like I said, provided that Kodak will still sell us the movie film stock to begin with. But let me know in the comments what you think about these new changes by Kodak. I think it's pretty cool. It shows that Kodak is still spending money with R&D as it relates to film photography, and that we've got more good, exciting things to come in the future from Kodak. And if you want a more fully fleshed out discussion of Kodak crushing film resellers, I think that video provides a pretty useful context for this video. Take a look at that. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.